Because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot of enemies.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of what I believe is going to be called In Defense of Climate Change. I'm Bryce Nickels, a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm joined by Roger Pielke Jr., who is emeritus professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He currently runs a Substack called The Honest Broker, in which he highlights data analysis and commentary missing from public discussions of science policy and politics. And in particular, you focus on climate science and climate policy, and you try to give a middle of the road, or I guess you try to give the truth about these issues. And of course, as we all know, climate science and climate policy are one of the most polarizing issues today. That's why I reached out to Roger and I said, I'm interested in starting a series of podcasts with you because I really like the approach that you have towards this issue. I like the fact that you're constantly attacked by people. That to me says that like you're probably doing something right. And I don't know a lot about this issue and I'd like to learn more. And so the goal here is for you and I to have some conversations that will supplement or support the work that you're doing on your Substack page, The Honest Broker, and have a little fun while we do it. So the first thing is, are you okay with the idea that this is going to be called In Defense of Climate Change? Of course, I'm doing a series called In Defense of Virology with Simon Wayne Hobson, and I thought perhaps I could sort of, extend that brand into other areas. So is that title okay with you?
Yeah, I think that works great. I think it's, you talk about, well, first, Bryce, great to be with you. It's interesting because you talk about, taking a middle of the road approach, and I'm not a big fan of middle of the road because, there's some things that some people have right and other people have right, but you can't just take the most extreme views and average them and come out about right. So we can talk about that. But, climate change is real and it's serious. And so, we've got to be cautious throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So In Defense of Climate Change works great for me.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So I just was being a little bit intellectually lazy, as I tend to be, by just throwing out this, you take a middle of the road. The goal here is that you're actually trying to get as close to the truth about this as possible. And that is often a lonely place. And you've suffered a lot of cost, like personal cost, professional cost, by just having what appears to me to be like reasonable opinions and thoughts about things. For example, you're accused of taking money from the Koch brothers or whatever, like recently. But the point is, look, and frankly, if the Koch brothers or any oil companies want to support this podcast and be, donate to this, we'll certainly welcome that money. But it won't change the content of what we do here, because the goal here, and you're not actually, I should point out, you're not actually supported by oil companies or Koch brothers or whatever, or the sugar industry or anything like that. Is that
Big Sugar is one of my best funders. No, I mean you can tell on debates involving science that people are uncomfortable debating substance when they start invoking motives and funding. And, all of us who are in academia, or me when I was in academia, when we publish papers, we have conflict of interest disclosures and so on. And so, that's important, but it's not the main issues here. And I mean, to be honest, when you get an issue like climate change, which implicates the whole global energy ecosystem, there are a lot of interests on all sides. And so being aware of that is important. But the idea you're going to find, experts who are pure as the driven snow in this area is just, it's not gonna happen. Everybody's got to be affiliated with somebody, if nothing else, for a salary. So whether it's a university that takes big oil money, which there's a lot of them now, or you're affiliated with a think tank like I am that has donors. Everybody has a backstory to tell, and we try to manage that through disclosure of conflict of interest.
Regardless of who is funding whatever, I guess the point is that if we can sort of stay grounded in arguing on the substance, it is the right place to be. That being said, there are clear examples where financial motives are the main driver of debates on, and it's hard, and it actually is it's very difficult to separate the people who are trying to engage in the issue in good faith from ones that are not. So that's why I appreciate being able to identify someone like yourself who I could say, you are trying to do your best on this issue. So that being said, the first episode you wanted to talk about, I think you referred to this as the original sin. Is that what you said? Or not the original? Did you call it the original sin of climate change or climate science, or this idea of using scenarios or models as the basis for a lot of climate science and policy?
Yeah, I think at some point I wrote a Substack post titled "The Original Sin." But I mean, the larger story here is that, the first point to raise, climate change is real. Humans are influencing the climate system through the burning of fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere. That leads to a warming and other effects on the planet. It's not the only route through which humans affect the climate system. There are many others, but that's a starting point, that humans affect the climate system. What most people don't realize is that climate models, physical representations of the Earth system that are used to project climate futures, are not the starting point. They take as input scenarios of the future. How many people are going to be on the planet? What kind of an economy are we going to have? What kind of energy sources are we going to have? And given that carbon dioxide influences the climate, how much we emit in the next part of this century is going to influence how much the climate changes. The better tag for this is the best kept secret in all of climate science. The perspective on scenarios over the last 20 years, and really changing sharply in the last 5 years, has really evolved. Climate change went from a general view that it was potentially catastrophic, maybe apocalyptic in the vernacular of the community, 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100, 5 degrees, 6 degrees. I mean, that's a lot. That's something to pay attention to. But those have been scaled back, not because climate science has changed, but because the scenarios that feed into those projections has changed. And we could talk about that.
You just said, what you just stated for the record is that you are, man-made climate change is a thing, right? So why are you accused of being a climate denialist and stuff? So can you explain that before we get into the scenario? Then I want to have you talk about the development, like the integration of this concept of scenarios in climate science.
There's a very long and boring story that I've, experienced over my career. And I'll just, I'll give you an anecdote. 2001, I was a young scholar. I was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. I was a staff scientist. I had done research that was getting a lot of attention at the time, showing that, in particular, hurricane damages in the United States had increased, not because of more hurricanes or more intense hurricanes, because more people and more property in places where hurricanes hit, like think Miami Beach. It's not rocket science. It shouldn't be controversial. But at the time, I was getting a lot of attention. But this is also the time that climate change was becoming a big political issue. So George W. Bush gets elected, and he has a anti-climate policy agenda, which was kind of contrary to a lot of people in the environmental scientific communities.
Is this about like the environment, like the policies about the environment, or about like trying to reduce carbon emission?
Yeah, so it's the latter. It all boils down to energy policy, and I would characterize the pro-climate view as that climate science tells us we must get off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and the folks who are anti that agenda say, well, fossil fuels are pretty useful, and we're not too worried about the climate, and so we're going to keep burning fossil fuels. So it was really, the debate, and that's an oversimplification, but a lot of the debate is centered on continuing or not continuing to use fossil fuels. And so when the Bush administration came in, they said, we're going to focus on what, they called greenhouse gas intensity of the economy. They wanted to reduce how much we burn as a proportion of how much we produce. There were others, Al Gore, most notably at the time, who lost to George Bush, who framed energy policy as the answer to this apocalyptic threat. In 2001, I was invited by the National Academy of Sciences as part of a small select group of researchers to brief the Bush administration and members of the cabinet in Washington, D.C. And I was selected because I'm a social scientist. I do policy, and at the time, my work was getting a lot of attention. But after the invitation was publicized, and there's these 8 scientists going to go brief the Bush administration, I got an email from a colleague, very senior colleague. He's still kicking around, and he said to me at the time, he said, I want to make this explicit. Your research is good research, but because it emphasizes the role of development in property damage related to extreme weather, it might be used by Republicans to downplay the need for action on energy policy. So maybe you should think about how to characterize your own work. And for me, it was confronting in that I was asked to change kind of the story of my own research for a perceived political aim. And it's not the first time, and it certainly wasn't the last in my career where you come up to a fork in the road. Am I going to alter how I call things in research because of perceptions of politics or somebody in the community's perception of politics? And obviously, it's 25 years later. It's easy to see. I decided just to call things like I see them, and so I think for me, that's one reason why the loudest, the most influential climate activists in the science community don't like the work that I do or the platform that I have, because even though I support international assessments on climate science and called for a carbon tax, it's not enough. And sometimes I do I go off note. I sing from a different sheet of music, and they don't like that. And so, as virology is a good companion to climate change. There are some people in our communities who see their role as enforcing messages, and that if you go off note, that's a problem. And the more visible you are in doing so, the more vitriol and hatred comes your way. It's a privilege, honestly, to have to do work that's influential. So if people are coming after me, that's okay. That just means that I'm doing work that they perceive to be influential.
So then, okay, so let's go back then to the concept of
Yeah.
scenarios.
Earth system modelers. So Earth system models are models of the Earth system. You got the atmosphere, you got the oceans, you got the land surface, you got the sun, you got greenhouse gas, all of these components. They're ridiculously complex. They're amazing achievements. But in order to run them, you have to have inputs. You got to take a step back. And these inputs include, among any other things, future projected emissions. In the 1990s, there was a theory by a scientist named Rogner, published, I think, 1997, of what we can call learning by doing in energy systems. And the idea was that the energy systems that dominate the economy are only going to increasingly dominate the economy. They're going to grow in their share. And at the time, coal energy was the primary energy source worldwide. And so the idea was learning by doing. By implementing coal energy, we're going to get better at it. We're going to get better at extracting coal. We're going to get better at burning coal. We're going to eventually learn how to get liquids from coal and replace petroleum. And the idea was that coal was going to replace everything by the end of the century. Now, coal is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel. For the same amount of energy produced, you produce twice as much carbon with coal as you do with natural gas. And so the scenarios at the time, and there are thousands of scenarios, but at the time, they had a single point of failure. All of them assumed increasing consumption of coal going into the future. And the ones that were placed at the center of climate research were the ones that assumed the most increase in coal. And so not only were greenhouse gas emissions going to go up, they were going to go up massively. And so if you go back 20 years when these scenarios were first developed, and we're still using them in 2026, which is ridiculous because we know they're out of date. There were these very apocalyptic projections. The head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Bob Watson, said publicly, we could be headed for a world of 6-degree temperature change by 2100. That's a huge number in the context of projected change. For people who don't know, the goals of the Paris Agreement are below 2 degrees. Celsius. And so the gap between where we thought we were headed and where we wanted to be was massive. And so there was this very concerned apocalyptic view of, I would say of the generation of researchers that are, my parents' age. I often say if you could put them in a time machine, many of them aren't with us anymore, but put them in a time machine and bring them forward to 2026, they'd be really surprised at how things have changed. Because, long story short, and we can get into this, the world is not transitioning to coal. Sure, there are places like India, China, Indonesia that consume a lot of coal and will continue to do so. But most people don't realize the rest of the world had peak coal consumption around 2007, almost 2 decades ago. The world is not heading headlong into this massive emissions future. And so just to close that circle, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the international body that negotiates international approaches to responding to climate change through energy policy, just in December 2025, just a few months ago, in its official statement said that they believe the world is headed to 2.2 to 2.4 degrees temperature change by 2100. It's not the 2 degrees of the Paris Agreement, but my goodness, it is way off the 6 degrees that Bob Watson warned about 20 years ago. So the expectations of future climate change have really been scaled back. Doesn't make the problem go away, doesn't make it not real, but it does change how we ought to think about facing that challenge.
Was the first time you wrote about this issue was this back in 2021? This article that you had sent me to take a look at before our conversation called How Climate Scenarios Lost Touch with Reality. Is that the first time you sort of flagged this issue? Is that correct to say?
There's a longer history there. I mean, back in the aughts, 2008, with an economist named Chris Green and a climate scientist, Tom Wigley, we published a paper that basically took apart the scenarios that were in play at that time. And we found that they built in some pretty heroic assumptions across all the scenarios about how fast the energy system could change, and we were skeptical that climate policy could work as fast as was being proposed, regardless of which scenario you chose. I put scenarios to the side for a while. I had to deal with some things like a congressional investigation and the Obama administration coming after me. That's another story.
I think we talked about that last time when we talked.
And I have to emphasize this. A colleague of mine, a younger scholar, Justin Ritchie, University of British Columbia, wrote a PhD in the 20-teens on scenarios. And I first encountered his work, I think 2017, maybe early work in 2016. And I immediately said, this is some of the most important research on climate I've ever seen. And all credit to Justin. I collaborated with him since, but really from about 2017, I was back into the scenario game, and we've published a bunch of papers since then. And so that 2021 article is just, one dip in the river on these issues.
With respect to that, and that was that 2021 article, which you co-wrote with Justin Ritchie, you did open, I thought, with an interesting parallel, because I'm a life science researcher, of course, and you talked about how the biomedical sciences, you gave an example of how there's, now I guess probably several thousand papers using the wrong cell line, using a skin cancer line to be studying breast cancer as an example of as a parallel to what you saw happening in climate research with the use of scenarios that just were not grounded in reality.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes science and such, so important is that it is self-correcting. When we make mistakes, we fix them. What isn't understood is that self-correction, as you said, doesn't happen overnight, and it may take frustratingly long time. In climate science, the needs and demands of doing Earth system modeling are so great. You need so much computational time. You need so much time to do your runs, to write your papers, to do the analyses. Scenarios that inform them, the ones that I've described, they get fixed. And they only are replaced every decade or so, if we're lucky. Consider that the scenarios that I've been describing that have so much coal in them, they were developed starting in 2005. Based on academic understandings of the energy system that go back to the 80s and 90s. And these scenarios that were developed starting in 2005 still dominate climate research published in 2026. And the frustrating thing is we've known for over a decade that the scenarios are out of date. Of course, scenarios go out of date. That's kind of the point. Is they're the best guess we have today at this moment in time on how the future is going to evolve. And guess what? There's pandemics, there's wars, the economy changes, there's AI becomes invented, didn't exist in 2005. So of course, scenarios will need to be updated. The climate community updates its scenarios in a frustratingly slow manner, meaning that the science that's published in 2026 is like looking in the rearview mirror. It's not reflecting the latest understandings. And so that is a huge frustration. And it is exactly like the contaminated cell lines. Once people get funding, once there's papers being produced, it's very hard to either correct the scientific record through retraction or correction, or to just scrub the outdated or flawed science from the science ecosystem. So will things be updated? Yeah, eventually, but maybe not till 2030, 2035, or, and so on. So that's the frustration.
When I hear you say this and describe what's going on in climate science, I mean, frankly, it sounds like the whole thing is bullshit. I'm just saying, like, so because you're relying on models and scenario and there are false premises underlying that, it just seems like it's squishy and it's not that reliable. So can you actually even defend using scenarios? Just to put a final point on this, you see a lot of people coming back to like Greta Thunberg or AOC, said that the world was going to end, in 5 or 10 years, and here we are. So these models that lead to those like apocalyptic claims, it seems like once you make that prediction and it turns out to be completely ridiculous again and again and again, you do lose the trust or respect even of the public. So how do I please defend? This is actually where in defense of climate change or climate science is sort of useful. Explain to me why I should believe anything any climate science researcher says based on what we've seen the last couple decades.
So there's a lot in there. And I will say, in 2026, separating out wheat from chaff in science, and not just my areas of expertise, but your areas of anybody's areas of is harder, I think, than at any point in my entire career. And I mean, there is the baby and bathwater issue. So let's start with first principles. The fact that humans are affecting the climate system, we don't need projective modeling based on scenarios to understand that. There are solid understandings of the dynamics and thermodynamics of the atmosphere. We have good observational data, particularly of the ocean temperatures since around 2000 with a network of floats called the Argo floats. So the fact that we are altering the climate system is a pretty well settled issue. And it's not just carbon dioxide. I talk about it because it's one of, if not the primary forcing agent, but there are many others as well. The reason that scenarios are necessary in climate research is that we can't predict the future. We are learning almost on a daily basis how poor our projections of future population on the planet have been for the last several decades. There's more concern now about peak population occurring mid-century than anyone being concerned about overpopulation, which was a concern of the 70s and 80s. And so scenarios are necessary because we need to prepare for a wide range of plausible futures. But the key there is that word plausible, to inform the sorts of policies that are robust to all sorts of futures. We need to be able to be brutally honest with what we think those futures look like. And just like with COVID and, the decision to go to war in Iraq and the recent decision to go to war in Iran, apocalyptic scenarios and stories are often used to try to motivate people to action. And so there is a political tension in the creation of scenarios for research in that some folks really, really, really want extreme scenarios because it makes the future, which nobody's experienced, so we have to depend on experts and models, makes the future look really, really bad so that, you don't have time to think. You have to act in this way today, and I'm the expert and I can tell you. Part of the challenge facing the climate movement, and I do think there is a movement, is that with scenarios becoming moderated, looking to the future, and I talked about coal, population is another factor. What if the world peaks population in 2060 rather than continuing to rise through 2100? That's going to lead to far fewer emissions also. I have argued that climate change has gone from, in the eyes of many people, being apocalyptic to being problematic. That doesn't make it not real, But for the normal member of the public, geez, if you pick up your favorite newspaper or you read your favorite website and it says, climate scientists project GDP to be cut by 40% by 2070. I mean, there is a lot of bullshit in those sorts of stories, and anyone who works with scenarios and models knows that you can, pick your favorite assumptions and make things look as nice or as bad as you want to. Climate economics has a huge problem. There's kind of this auction of apocalypse that's been in the literature, with people publishing ever more catastrophic claims. There's just recently a paper that in Nature that was retracted by Kotz et al. That it had its headline findings that climate change was going to be much worse than anyone had projected before, and it turns out it had a major error in how it handled the economy of Uzbekistan. But for generating headlines and for the normal public, they're not going to dig that deep to know that. So it's a mixed answer. Scenarios are readily misused by people, and they're misused on the other side too. People say, "Oh, look, no problem. There's climate change is not a thing." And so sorting out fact from fiction in these discussions is really, really difficult. I guess the saving grace is when it comes to policy, the sorts of policies we would implement to reduce emissions aren't justified just based on climate. There's a lot of reasons. We're learning, with many countries around the world are learning right at this moment that heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels may not be in their best interests. In Europe, both the Chancellor of Germany and the President of the European Commission in the last few weeks have said, "Oh, getting off of nuclear was a strategic mistake." Ursula von der Leyen said it just this week. You would never have heard that sort of thing 10 years ago. So if countries want to go nuclear, which is exceedingly low carbon, obviously, for geopolitical reasons, and it has the benefits of reducing emissions, well, that's great. That's not a climate policy. Maybe it's a energy security policy. But I mean, that's the good news, is no one has to be convinced of this or that climate future for a lot of these energy policy decisions to have a broad base and make good sense, with the result of decarbonizing the economy.
Is AI being used to help with these models? I'd hope. I assume it is, although that introduces additional problems perhaps. But can't we just update these models and scenarios like in real time each day with different measurements taken around the globe or something? Why does it take every 10 years? It seems ridiculous.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, of course we could. And if you take a look at the groups around the world who do energy system modeling, and they create scenarios, they do it every year. So the International Energy Agency, the Energy Information Administration, EIA in the US, and all the energy majors, they update their scenarios every year. The problem, and this gets to a problem of science, it's not climate politics, it's just a problem of science. The climate science community has evolved in a way where the models they run take much longer than a year. And so saying, here's an updated scenario in 2026, throw out the one you had in 2025. The answer would be, well, we're not done with our research yet using the 2025 scenario. We need a few more years with that scenario before we can use an updated one. The implication is, maybe we need two tracks in climate science, a more policy relevant track and a more research exploratory track, where the policy relevant track would say, all right, the constraint is we need to be able to develop projections of the future using scenarios that are updated on an annual basis. So maybe that involves less sophisticated models. Maybe it involves using AI. Maybe it involves, having a dashboard where you build your own scenario and you run it through a reduced form model or an emulator or something like that, and you get results that are credible, maybe not the most detailed as they could be based on these, very complex models, and that feeds into policy discussions. It is incredible to me. This happens on a daily basis, to see a paper published in the big journals, Nature, Science, American Meteorological Society, using scenarios developed in 2005, then filtered through university press offices and the media, ultimately landing in policy that is making decisions in 2026. Can you imagine if we made economic decisions based on economics data current only of 2005? It's ridiculous to think of. So the implications here for how climate science might be done are huge. And as you and I know, the scientific organizations and establishment has a lot of momentum. So someone showing, some social scientist, policy guy showing up and say, hey, I got a proposal for how you can do your modeling in a way that's more policy relevant, but you got to change everything. You can't be shown the door fast enough with that sort of an approach.
Have you proposed this before? Is this like this idea of having separate tracks? Is this something that you put out there before?
The first time we put this out there, my colleague Dan Sarowitz from Arizona State University and I wrote a piece in Issues in Science and Technology in 2003, I think, and we talked about the social responsibility of climate science. And the social responsibility was to make sure that the research that's being done didn't just advance scientific understandings, but it also contributed to the information needs of policymakers. There is a letter that was written in response to us from a group of, 6 climate modelers who were really pissed off. Like, what do you mean the needs of climate science shouldn't come first? Climate science is important irrespective of any policy applications. And so the idea, and I remember we went to a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences, to the Board on Atmospheric Sciences and Climate, so the big climate board at the National Academies. And we presented our paper and our argument for a more practically focused approach to climate science. And this is no joke. The chair of the committee, guy I knew, in the field, but a senior guy who went on to be a university president, he banged the table. He said, well, if the research we're doing can't be justified as policy relevant because it takes too long or it's not properly focused, then you tell me, how do we justify modeling to get the budgets that we need and observational data? Our response was, that's not our problem. If, we're focused on trying to get research that's relevant to policy. So this has always been a core tension in climate science. It's got nothing to do with the hot politics of climate change or energy policy, but the demands and needs of the climate research community are justified in terms of their policy relevance, but the community hasn't organized itself to produce results that are as relevant as they could be. And that's just a core tension that's been in the community. It's been recognized. There's been several academies reports on this, but and and I know because we're in the field, when the needs of the research community conflict with the broader needs of applications and policy, don't expect researchers to decide against their own self-interest. That's just the way it is.
So you believe that we should keep basic research on climate as a separate thing from the policy piece of this?
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to, if it is important to understand the Earth system, and if people want to use fanciful, implausible scenarios to do so. I mean, if someone wants to say, all right, what would happen if there's research like this, if we dam the Mediterranean at the Strait of Gibraltar, what would it do to the atmosphere? It's not going to happen, but it's an interesting thought experiment, and you can learn something from it. Or if you say, well, what if all of the ice in Antarctica melted? What if it all melted in the next 50 years? I mean, it's not going to happen, but you could have a lot of interesting results from conducting research. I don't want to tell anyone, you can't do that research. So, maybe as a way to go forward, we say, all right, we're going to have 2 tracks. We're going to have the policy relevant track where we update scenarios every single year. And the community figures out how do we make use of that information for policy relevant purposes. And then the slower track where people say, yeah, we have super sophisticated models and we're going to explore some things that may or may not be policy relevant in the short term, but we hope to learn a lot.
This sounds like basic and applied.
Yeah, those terms aren't wrong, and they get misused and kicked around a lot. The problem is, and I think we see this in medicine and biology also, that people love to justify basic research in terms of applications, because that's how if you go before Congress and say, yeah, we want a bunch of money for basic research, we don't know if there's going to be any practical results on any timescale that you care about. Historically, members of Congress will say, yeah, okay, you'll get funding like the National Endowment for the Humanities, not like NIH focused on diseases. So there is this tension in the scientific community to always frame basic research as being more practically applied than it is. And what I'm saying is, let's just have a cleaner division. And scenarios are a great opportunity for that, because if you're only updating your scenarios every decade, pretty easy to say you're not really policy relevant, instead of the opposite.
And this gets to this point about the NIH and the justification of funding basic research. How do you explain to the public that most of what basic research is, like most of what the basic researchers do, isn't doesn't have any immediate benefit to public health at all. But some of it does. And when it does, it has this tremendous impact. Because it's a black box, you can't predict where these innovations and tremendous scientific advances are going to occur. You need to bet on thousands and thousands of things, because if one of them hits and becomes successful, it's going to have a tremendous, like, transformative impact on society. So out of the thousands of research projects that are funded, it may be that only one of them has impact, but you're not going to be able to predict in advance which one that is. So you kind of have to spread your bets out amongst all of these different things. But then you have a situation where individual researchers have to justify their existence when they're doing something that sounds kind of stupid. Like, how does, like, I would just say, like, I studied transcription in bacterial cells, and we study how the protein, functions and all this stuff. And everyone will say, like, well, are you curing disease? And I say, well, not immediately, but the impact, so the impact is potentially in the knowledge that's generated. It can be used by somebody else, blah, blah, blah. It's difficult you can't, on an individual basis, you can't justify basic research projects. The reason they exist is the collective of them could lead to tremendous advances, like, because one or two of them hit, or like a small percentage of them hit. I don't know. Is that kind of what you see with climate as well? Like,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, and I definitely agree with your characterization of the importance of a portfolio of basic research. I actually did a paper 2013, and it was titled "Basic Research as a Political Symbol." I've written a lot on science policy and the notion of basic and applied research. The phrase basic research comes from the 1920s. It first originated in a report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which it stated, this is a near quote, "Research is the basic work of the Department of Agriculture." And that got concatenated into basic research. As everyone probably knows, the Department of Agriculture does very little basic research. It's almost all applied research focused on crop yields and so on. Basic research started out as actually what we today call applied research. And over time, so before then, the research community used to use the phrase pure research. We do pure research. And the idea that it would be subject to practicality and application was a negative at the time. You could do physics, then you're up there. But if you're doing engineering, you're just applying the work of physicists. And so basic research in the scientific community has always been on a higher plane. Alvin Weinberg wrote about this, the axiology of science. But you flash forward to Vannevar Bush after the war, and the idea that basic research in this portfolio sense was going to be a driver of technologies, of the economy, and so on. It became a fixture in U.S. science policy. But and this is where the paradox is. The scientific community would say, well, we need more funding for basic research. We can't tell you the benefits of any single project or area of research. So the more you fund, the more hits we'll get across that portfolio. In terms of accountability, and if you're Congress, it's a very unsatisfying argument that, we can't tell if NSF or USDA or Department of Energy or NIH is going to have the best payoffs. So the only answer is let's give everybody more money, and we'll increase the hit rate. That sounds great for universities and scientists to make the argument, but when you're competing against pensions for the military and healthcare and so on, which have very tangible benefits today and tomorrow, it's a very hard argument for the scientific community to make. I would flip things on its head, and I would argue that basic research should ride on the coattails of the benefits of applied research. If people see their energy bills going down, if the food at the supermarket's cheaper, they see their healthcare is being taken care of, they're going to be pretty happy with the outcomes related to the applied research portfolios. And then it's pretty easy to add on a basic research component to that larger portfolio. But justifying basic research in terms of applications, in my view, is always going to be politically difficult, and it leads to these overstated claims about what basic research can do. It's a necessary element, but the action as far as politics and the public is in the applications of science that they see every day.
The problem basic research has now is COVID, frankly. I believe, and many believe, that COVID was created, SARS-CoV-2 was created through research. And this particular form of research, dangerous gain-of-function research, its defenders have argued that it's needed as basic research. So here we are, like with a problem where your basic researchers are creating things that could cause tremendous harm.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So like the key problem here is that you collapse support for basic research if you are doing things that don't have immediate benefit to society that threaten society, right? And that's where we are.
I mean, climate has its own version of gain-of-function research with what's called geoengineering. The idea that we're going to tinker intentionally with the climate system to make it "quote unquote" better, or to reduce the negative effects. That has enormous potential for outcomes as bad as a pandemic. So yes, there are these Dr. Frankenstein versions of basic research that threaten not just the specific portfolio they're talking about, but honestly, a focus on geoengineering research threatens all of climate research, because people, normal people out in the real world aren't going to be able to differentiate.
And that's maybe something we'll talk about on a future episode. Last comment about the climate models and scenarios that you sort of take home for today.
Yeah, the take home for today is climate change is real. It's problematic. It's not the end of the world. And that's based on the latest consensus, mainstream, center, whatever you want to call it, where the bulk of the science lies today. Maybe in 5 or 10 years, the world will have changed all to coal energy. I don't think so. But from the perspective of today, the world's not doing that. And so the apocalyptic projections that people have really come of age with over the last 2 decades, start with Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, those aren't where the scientific community is today. Sure, you can find them in the media, you can find them on Twitter, you can find them, pick your favorite climate advocate, but understanding where the science actually is for people who care about the issue is important, and there'll be surprises for everybody. People who think it's a hoax and people who think it's the apocalypse. The science is pretty surprising.
All right. Well, thank you, Roger, for this recording the first episode, what I hope will be many episodes in defense of climate change. Until next time, my name is Bryce Nickels. Take care, everyone.